In our project, we used regulatory data for charities in England, Wales and Scotland to explore the effects of the pandemic on the income and expenditure of charities and on particular components of their income. And we took this approach in contrast to the small-scale open access surveys that have characterised the evidence base in the field. We did this because the value of this regulatory data is its large scale. We've got information on headline economic indicators for as many as 150,000 charities per annum, with quite a bit of detail for 12,500 larger ones in England and Wales. The data reports what's actually happened, not organisations' perceptions or expectations. It's consistently reported over time, and it's also available over a long period of time. We have around 20 years of data now to put the COVID experience into perspective. So in other words, we can contextualise the past 2 years against the experience of the past 2 decades. The scale of it's also helpful for another reason. Much of the debate in this field is about aggregates. Claims, for instance, that there would be multi-billion pound losses of income to the sector as a result of the economic consequences of COVID and the public health measures taken to contain it. But not all organisations were going to be affected in the same way. Some income streams reliant on face-to-face interactions and transactions were cut off entirely by the most severe lockdowns. Others much less so, such as investments income, legacies, standing orders and so forth. And restrictions on service delivery meant that for many organisations, expenditure was also severely constrained. Following the order of the project, I will start with some comments on reserves and on the experience of financial vulnerability in the course of the project as revealed by returns from the Charity Commission and Oscar since March 2020. Dermot and Alan will then focus on the income composition of charities and try to break down the experience that we've seen because of the differential exposure of organisations to different sources of income. Alasdair will then look at patterns of openings and closures of organisations responding to survey data in which individual organisations express great fears that their organisation will be out of business as a result of COVID. The papers from the project so far are on our website, so what we're doing today is very much an overview, but there are some new or updated findings. So to begin then with reserves. Unrestricted reserves can provide charities with financial flexibility to smooth out the effects of revenue instability. But what level of reserves ought charities to hold? Regulatory guidance isn't prescriptive. Charities are advised to make assessments of external circumstances which could affect their ability to generate funds. But it's reasonable to suggest that few, if any, organisations thought it prudent to hold reserves sufficiently large to insulate their organisation against an event of the scale and character of the COVID pandemic. And in fact, a sizable minority of charities have under 3 months, the equivalent of under 3 months expenditure in their unrestricted reserves. This draws on the Part B returns for charities in England and Wales for the last financial year before the onset of the pandemic. Each column indicates the number of months that a charity has in terms of expenditure available from its unrestricted reserves. As you can see, for around 20% of organisations, it's 1 month or less, and in fact, around 10% of organisations had no reserves to speak of. Something like just over 40% of organisations have less than 3 months expenditure in unrestricted reserves. In the briefing paper on this, we go into quite a bit more detail, considering variations by field of activity age and size of organisation. One of the points I think it's relevant to re-emphasise here is we found that the organisations that were most reliant on charitable activities, which is to say sales of their services, including through public service contracts, most reliant on such sources for their income, seem to have, on average, lower levels of reserves. Now, if such organisations are being expected to shoulder increased responsibility for frontline service provision, that vulnerability is important. How do they build up reserves on the tight margins often associated with such contracts? Two other points in relation to reserves. The Part B returns ask organisations to report on unrestricted free reserves. We wanted to explore in a bit more detail the reliability of this indicator, so we looked at how the figures reported to the Charity Commission compared with what was being stated in the detail of annual accounts. And we did this for a sample of 400 charities. The key take-home message from that exercise: we think the Part B returns may actually overestimate the true level of unrestricted free reserves for some organisations. While in most cases there's a correspondence between the figure on unrestricted free reserves in the Part B returns and the accounts of charities, there's subsets of organisations where they seem perhaps to have been reporting items which might be subject to restrictions on spending of some kind, and which might therefore, if incorporated in a statement of unrestricted free reserves, overstate the reserves position of the organisation. These might include fixed assets or income streams that were designated for particular future purposes. Secondly, what's happened to reserve levels? From the updates we've had over the last 2 years, we don't as yet see a distinctive decline in levels of reserves for financial years ending post March 2020. This could possibly be because of the balance between income and expenditure. While income has been affected, there have been even more severe constraints on spending. As I indicated earlier, there are certainly some income streams very heavily affected by COVID-19, others perhaps less so, and as a consequence we may find that some organisations actually accumulate resources and reserves. If we look back to the 2008-9 recessionary period, we found there that the reserves position of organisations definitely worsened and took a while to recover. But in 2008-9, organisations would have been free to continue spending to meet rising needs because they wouldn't have been subject to the COVID-related constraints on activity. And that could potentially explain why we appear to have seen more evidence of drawing down of reserves after that recession. Moving on to financial vulnerability. As I said earlier, there was a bit of an emphasis at the onset of COVID on producing sector-wide estimates of the aggregate losses of resources to charities in the order of several billion pounds. But these may be heavily influenced by small numbers of large losses, and some high-profile cases have been reported in the media over the last couple of years. What we try to do, because such losses in a small number of organisations might account for the bulk of a reduction, we try instead to emphasise what's happening to what we might term a typical organisation, or organisations at particular points in the distribution of things like growth rates of income. So for instance, we focus on the 50th percentile, the median of the growth rate distribution. You rank the growth rates for charities from top to bottom, and we take the 50th percentile, the organisation at the midpoint of that distribution. We've emphasised reductions in income in previous work. I'm going to say a little bit more today about the ratio of income to expenditure. But just to re-emphasise, from a previous presentation, and this is updated with regard to the most recent information from the Charity Commission, which includes now some 90,000 organisations that have reported on their income and expenditure for financial years ending after March 2020. So that alone is probably more reports than every single social survey on the COVID pandemic among charities that's been conducted since March 2020, just to emphasise the scale of the data. The median of the annual relative growth rate in income after adjusting for inflation is just below the line, equating to a growth rate of 0.87. In other words, the median and the upper of these two graphs is a reduction in resources of around 13%. And this graph compares the same figure over the preceding 20 years. As you can see, it's way out of line with anything that's previously been experienced since we've had large-scale versions of the Charity Commission data. And the 25th percentile, likewise, that's the bottom. Below that are the bottom quarter of organisations in terms of reductions in resources. The 25th percentile is around 0.57, or a 43% reduction in income. We look at expenditure, and actually the medians and the 25th percentile reductions are even greater. The median change in expenditure for English and Welsh charities was a drop of 16% compared to a drop of 13% of income. And at the 25th percentile, the median change in expenditure was a drop of 47%, or pretty close to half. So this is possibly pointing us in the direction of looking at constraints on expenditure as well as reductions in income. And so what we go on to do, and I'll finish with this before passing on to Dermot and Alan, is to look at the ratio of expenditure to income. And there are some interesting patterns in this graph. So again, on the horizontal axis we have years, a 20-year period from the millennium up to the present day. The vertical axis, a score of 1, indicates that a charity is spending all of the income it's got coming in. A figure of 1.2 indicates that it's spending 20% more in that particular year than its incoming resources, and a figure of 0.5 would indicate that it's spending half of what it's got coming in. And you probably wouldn't expect a charity to spend every last penny it's got coming in every year. So what we find with the median expenditure, which is the middle of these 5 lines here, the one just below the solid line at the point of 1 on the vertical axis, the median charity in the period prior to COVID was spending around 95% of its income. But where we have data after the for 2020, we see that the median is around 0.9, or 90% of annual income. The other feature of this graph is the divergence in the experience of organisations. At the 90th percentile, so that's the topmost line here, the ratio of expenditure to income reaches nearly 1.6, a marked uptick from the previous year. So 10% of organisations are spending nearly 60% more than they've got coming in, whereas in the previous year, 10% of organisations were spending something like 40% more than what they'd got coming in. At the 10th percentile, the bottom line, typically in the 10 years before COVID, at the 10th percentile, the ratio of expenditure to income was 50%. So a small proportion of organisations, 10%, was spending half of what they had coming in. And that drops to 35% in 2020. So organisations here are clearly still receiving money, but it seems that something is preventing them from spending it. So we've got bifurcation. Some organisations are spending more than they earn, trying to sustain activity in the face of rising needs. Others are unable to spend their incoming resources. So in short, and to finish, referring to our back to our previous presentation on financial vulnerability, COVID was plainly unprecedented, a different order of magnitude of financial vulnerability to anything we've previously recorded. A typical charity's lost a seventh of its resources, and a quarter have lost 2/5. And it's important not to forget the balance between income and expenditure. Some organisations are spending much more than they receive, while others seem to have been unable to spend what they have.
Hello, my name is Duggan, and I'm here today to talk to you about income dependence and diversification. So to get started, the logic of revenue diversification is simple and compelling. It hedges against uncertainty and provides flexibility in response to unstable environmental conditions. Charities with diverse income profiles can be more resilient and better able to smooth out temporary shocks and imbalances between different income streams. However, such diversification is not without cost, for example, administrative cost, mission drift, and exposure to unstable income streams. Some recent systematic reviews and meta-analyses have found a small positive association between revenue diversification and non-profit financial health. However, we know little about this topic in the UK, and one of the key areas for debate when COVID arrived was the exposure of particular organisations to sources of funding which, being reliant on face-to-face interactions, were likely to be adversely affected by lockdown measures. So when we look at some of the definitions and data used in this analysis, the first one is income dependence, and this is defined as the percentage of total income derived from a single income stream. So for example, a charity has a dominant income stream if it receives at least 90% of total funding from one income stream, for example, donations or charitable activities. When we look at income diversification, this is defined as the degree to which total income is derived from one or more income streams, and this uses the Herfindahl-Hirschman index. Finally, when we look at the data we have available for these analyses, we have information on income streams for charities with an income greater than £500,000 in England and Wales and over £250,000 in Scotland. So when we look at the analysis side, we see that we essentially look at income dependence and diversification and how these vary across charity size and age, main income stream, the field of charitable activity, and the previous level of income dependence and diversification of a given charity. When we look at the diversification measure, we consider the median of this index, the HHI index, as this gives us a better look at a typical charity. And it's considered a more helpful measure than looking at the mean, which can be sensitive to a small number of large outlying values. So when we look at some headline figures from the analysis, we note that 50 to 51% of charities have a dominant income stream, i.e. they have an income stream that makes up 90% or more of their total revenue. The diversification measure also reveals a high degree of revenue concentration in the sector, with around 4 in 10 organisations almost entirely dependent on one stream. We note that field of activity, organisation size, main income stream and prior status are significant predictors of income dependence and diversification, and this is true in both descriptive and multivariate analysis. We note that as yet there has been no discernible shift in the long-term trend in reliance due to the pandemic. And finally here, the degree of income dependence and diversification is quite stable over time, both within organisations and across the sector. This table provides some results from the income dependence analysis for both England and Wales and for Scotland. The most notable results here are probably seen on the bottom row, where we see between 50 and 51% of charities in both jurisdictions have at least 90% of their total revenue coming from only one stream. And we also note here that there is between 96 and 97% of charities where their total, or at least 50% of their total revenue is coming from one stream. The distribution of charities according to their dependence on any given income stream is quite revealing, but is also limited in some ways. Therefore, we turn our attention to a more nuanced measure of funding reliance, and that's income diversification using the Herfindahl-Hirschman index. So this graph shows the distribution of this measure within the data. If we look on the horizontal axis, lower values indicate highly diversified income profiles, whereas higher values suggest income concentration. Around 40% of organisations are almost entirely dependent on one stream for all of their annual income when looking at this measure. And when we look at this graph, a score of around 8,000 or more, for example, represents a charity receiving 80 to 90% of their annual income from only one stream. Meanwhile, we see that there's a short lower tail in the distribution, such that only around 14% of charities have some degree of income diversification, defined here as being a score under 5,000. So as noted earlier in the analysis, there's a high degree of stability in the degree of income dependence and diversification over time. So looking at these graphs, the one on the left-hand side uses the regulator data that we've used in the earlier analyses, and this suggests, as we can see here, that there is a significant degree of income concentration and that it is quite stable over time. This data has some limitations, though. So, for example, it does not provide information on a charity's sources of revenue. So, for example, voluntary income could be received from individuals or government or other charities or private sector organisations. So, to overcome some of these limitations, we draw upon an additional source of data for England and Wales, and these are digitised copies of charities' annual accounts. And in this case, the graph on the right uses this accounts data and also suggests, as we can see here, a high degree of income concentration and a fairly high degree of stability in that concentration as well. This accounts data suggests that around 89% of charities depend on a single revenue source for a majority of their total income, and around 45% are almost exclusively funded by one particular income source. Okay, so when we look at some key messages to take away from this analysis, we note that there are high levels of income dependence and concentration across the sector, and there's a high degree of path dependence within charities for these measures. So using a range of longitudinal statistical modelling approaches, we consistently find that the level of income dependence in the previous reporting period is the most important predictor of dependence in the next period, and this is even after controlling for relevant organisational characteristics. These time trends and their stability are particularly noteworthy given the large-scale economic shocks that occurred over the study period, i.e. the Great Recession and the pandemic. And as yet, we see no discernible shift in long-term income reliance as a result of the pandemic.
Thanks, Alan. Given what we've seen so far about the financial vulnerability of charities in the UK, we're rightly concerned about the impact the pandemic might have on the ongoing viability of charities, as well as on the formation of new ones. In this part, we're going to look at what the data tells us about the number of new charities started and also the number of existing charities that have ceased during the period of the pandemic. A lot of the existing evidence looks at high quality snapshots, cross sections in time of the state of the sector. And some of this has been surveys conducted to ask charities about their reflections and predictions for the impact of the pandemic. And those have painted quite a dark picture with large number of organisations concerned about their ability to continue operating in these conditions. Those snapshots are timely and are the experience of those organisations, but by looking at the regulatory data, we get a continuous look as well as a comparison with the historic trends that help us to understand what might be happening. So first, some definitions. By formation, we mean the creation and registration of a new charity with the respective regulator in one of the UK jurisdictions. And by dissolution, we mean the deregistration or removal from the register of a charity in that jurisdiction. So what are our headline findings? Well, I'm going to show you that we've observed fewer dissolutions in both 2020 and 2021 than we would have expected based on historical trends. The charity formations have also fallen, but not by as much, and there's some evidence that they've been recovering in late 2021. And we'll also see briefly that these sorts of patterns have been replicated in other jurisdictions in other parts of the world as well. In this graph, we are looking at England and Wales. And what we have is a time series of the numbers of charity formations in blue and charity dissolutions in red that we've observed from 2015 to the most recent data that we have. The scatter plot shows you the monthly figures, and the line graph shows you an average of that pattern so that we can see a trend. The shaded grey area on the right-hand side of the graph is the COVID-19 restriction period from March 2020. So what do we see here? Well, we can see that the number of both formations and dissolutions is very variable. It jumps around from month to month over time. Sometimes there's quite a lot, and sometimes there's fewer. But the longer term trend is a bit more stable. We can see that moving around a bit, but we can see that there's a reasonable long run average in the number of charities being created and dissolved. So what do we see at the onset of COVID? Well, it's particularly striking here with the red line that there's a big drop in the number of charities dissolved around the start of the pandemic. But also that through the course of 2020 and 2021, that hasn't really recovered. We're seeing still far fewer charities being removed from the register than we would see in normal times pre-COVID. On formations, the story is similar, though not as pronounced. There is a drop at the start of the pandemic. It's a bit more pronounced. There's a little bit of a delay. So early 2021, we see more of a drop, and some evidence that at the end of the period that's starting to pick up again. But the impact hasn't been as big compared to the historical trend. And here's the same graph for Scotland. So again, charity formations in blue, charity dissolutions in red. We see a lot of variability. There are obviously fewer charities being formed and dissolved in Scotland than in England and Wales, but the same variability over time. At the start of the pandemic, we see a sharp drop in the number of charities being removed, although in Scotland this seems to have recovered a bit more, particularly in early 2021, but still below the longer term average to some degree. The impact on formations has been much less. Again, there was a bit of a lag, and we do see a drop towards the end of 2020 in the number of new charities being formed. But again, that seems to have recovered, and there's not strong evidence that is lower by today. This graph lets us compare the number of charity formations in England and Wales and Scotland to a number of other jurisdictions around the world that have similar regulatory frameworks to the UK. The central zero vertical line there is the longer run average number of charities that are formed, examined between 2015 and 2019, and points to the right of that mean that there were more formations, and to the left means there were fewer formations. And we can see that for most jurisdictions in 2021 there were fewer formations. That's less pronounced in 2020. Here's the equivalent figure for charity dissolutions, for charities removed from the register. Again, that central vertical line is the long-run pre-pandemic average, and points that to the left of that mean there have been fewer dissolutions, to the right means there has been more. And here we can see a stronger pattern. In most jurisdictions, there were fewer charities removed from registers during 2020 and 2021 than there had been in the long run average. And those years are real outliers in the numbers of charities being removed. So what are our key messages from this analysis? Well, first of all, surprisingly, and despite some doom-laden initial predictions, we haven't seen a big fall in the number of charities due to the pandemic. In fact, charities removed from the register have been much lower, and charities being formed have been a bit lower, and so the number of charities have grown, and it's above what we would expect to see from the historical data. This seems pretty counterintuitive given what we've seen through our analysis of the different domains of financial vulnerability of charities in the UK and the state of finances going into the pandemic. But it is possible that some of the forms of support, government grants, furlough, some emergency COVID support, have allowed some charities to continue that might otherwise have ceased to operate, even in normal times, not just from the impact of the pandemic. So let's take stock of what we've seen in the workshop so far. The questions we really want to answer is, to what extent has COVID had unprecedented impacts on the fortunes of charities in the UK? And to what extent does the approach that we've taken provide good evidence of those impacts. What we've presented you with today has really just been highlights of what has been a large body of research using a wide range of administrative and regulatory data sources on charities and their finances. But the key points are that charity reserves for many charities are quite low. And there's some evidence that perhaps they're overstated in some of the regulatory data that makes it difficult to accurately estimate how much charities have in reserve. We have seen dramatic reductions in both charity income and expenditure, and reductions that are large even when compared to previous impacts of the financial crisis and the Great Recession more than a decade ago. We know that many organisations are reliant on a small number of income streams, which can increase risk of financial volatility, but that exposure to the financial impacts of COVID have varied quite a lot depending on the specific income streams that organisations were dependent on. So it was particular income streams, such as some forms of fundraising, charity shops, that were disrupted by lockdown restrictions more than others. But the puzzle at the end of this is that despite these impacts, we haven't yet seen any evidence of greater organisational demise. Now we know that in previous recessions we have seen an uptick in the number of charities being insolvent, having to wrap up, and we haven't yet seen that as a result of this crisis. So there is a concern, given that body of evidence about the financial risks and the financial vulnerability, that impact may yet still be to come. So this project provides some description, it provides some answers, but it also poses some questions as well. The distinguishing feature of this project is its reliance on the actual reported administrative data that gives us a continuous time picture and quite a lot of detail on the finances of charities, both before and during the pandemic period. As we collect successive waves, as more data comes in, we'll be able to better track these and better understand the patterns and see how this plays out. So we both want to share the emerging findings as they stand to help us understand what the situation is and what the impact has been, but we also want to keep generating evidence that will help us to understand how that has evolved and whether there are longer term impacts on the financial vulnerability and the stability of the UK charitable sector. Of course, there is always scope for more research, and there is potential in particular to dig down into some more of the detail and look at the trajectories of some organisations over time and how these impacts play out, that it would be really valuable to look at. As our project comes to an end, the government have recently announced a response to the report by Danny Kruger MP on the proposals for a new social covenant to sustain and grow the contribution of voluntary organisations. And central to those recommendations and the government's response is an acknowledgement of the need for an improved evidence base. We feel that the insights from this project into the resources and the resilience of charitable organisations would, if extended and continued, be a really integral part of that evidence base. It's only by having good evidence both historically but also timely and contemporaneously that we're able both to respond to a crisis but also to process and understand the longer term implications of that crisis. We hope that you've enjoyed hearing about the different aspects of this project, and that you'll also be interested in the report and associated briefing papers, which give you a bit more detail into some of the things we've looked at and some of our findings. But thanks again for coming along today, and we look forward to joining in questions and discussion through the rest of the session.